I never used to believe in urban legends. Chain letters, haunted websites, cursed objects. They were just noise. Stories we told ourselves to pass the time, like campfire tales for the digital age. But now, after what I've experienced, I know better. I've tried to warn people, but no one listens. Maybe you will. Or maybe, like me, you'll learn the hard way. It started on a Wednesday night. I remember because Wednesdays were my cheat nights, beer, bad TV, and aimless scrolling on my laptop. That's when I found the post on a forum I didn't even recall joining. The Brothers, a photo you can't unsee, the title read. Clickbait, obviously. I clicked anyway. The post was short, written by someone with a username like Phantomize66. It described a black and white photo of two twin boys. The instructions were detailed. Search for vintage photo of twin boys, and look for an image of two boys dressed as sailors. One would have a blank expression, and the other a slight, unsettling smile. A smile that stays with you, the post said. I knew it was stupid, but I opened another tab and typed in the words. Among dozens of images, I immediately spotted the one. Two boys, about 7 years old, stood side by side against a weathered wooden fence. Their sailor uniforms were immaculate, their white hats perched perfectly. The boy on the left stared blankly at the camera, his face devoid of emotion. But the one on the right, his lips curled into a thin, unnatural smile. It wasn't the smile of a child. It was predatory. I stared at the photo for too long. Something about it drew me in. The smiling boy's eyes seemed to glint even in the grayscale image. According to the post, the picture was harmless unless you decided to pass it on. I closed my laptop, determined to forget about it. That night, I had the first dream. It began in a room I didn't recognize, though something about it felt strangely familiar. It was a dark, cavernous space, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly, with walls that were barely visible, fading into shadows. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive weight, like the world was holding its breath just before a storm. It was suffocating. Every sound, my breathing, the faint creak of my footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the void. I felt like I was underwater, my lungs laboring to draw in air that felt damp and stagnant. At first, I thought I was alone. The darkness pressed in on me from every side, and my eyes strained to adjust. I moved cautiously, my steps hesitant, unsure of what lay ahead, or behind me. The silence was deafening, a void that made the faint pounding of my heart sound like a drumbeat in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to wake up, but my feet wouldn't obey. Then I saw them. At first, they were just shapes in the distance, vague, indistinct outlines that slowly sharpened into the figures of two boys. The brothers stood side by side, illuminated by an unseen light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They were eerily still, their sailor uniforms pristine and their white hats slightly tilted. I recognized them immediately from the photograph. The boy on the left, the one with the blank expression, turned his head slowly. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. Without a sound, he began to walk away, his figure dissolving into the darkness with each step. It wasn't like watching someone disappear into shadow. It was more like he became a part of it, swallowed whole by the void. That left the other one. The smiling boy didn't move at first. He just stood there, his hands at his sides, his head tilted slightly as though studying me. His smile, it was the same slight, unsettling curl of the lips I'd seen in the photo. But here, it seemed alive, shifting ever so slightly, as if it were breathing. His eyes gleamed, their glint unnatural and predatory, reflecting a light that wasn't there. I wanted to move, to look away, but I was frozen in place. My legs felt like lead, and my gaze was locked on him. He took a step forward. Just one. The sound of his shoe hitting the ground echoed far too loudly. cutting through the oppressive silence like a gunshot. And then he smiled wider. It wasn't human anymore. His lips stretched impossibly far, exposing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth that seemed to glisten with something wet. The longer I looked, the more distorted his face became. His jaw unhinged slightly, and his teeth gleamed like broken glass under an invisible spotlight. His eyes never left mine, pinning me in place like a bug under a magnifying glass. I wanted to scream. My throat burned with the effort, but no sound came out. I tried to close my eyes, to block out the sight of him, but my lids refused to obey. He took another step. This time his movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. When he finally reached me, he leaned in close, so close that I could see every jagged tooth in his gaping smile. His breath was cold, like the first chill of winter, and it sent shivers down my spine. Then he spoke. "Pass it on." His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear, slicing through the silence like a blade. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was deep, guttural, and laced with something cruel, something ancient. The words echoed in my mind as I woke, jolting upright in bed with a gasp. My heart was racing, hammering against my ribcage as though it were trying to escape. My shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to my skin uncomfortably. For a moment, I just sat there, staring into the darkness of my room, trying to steady my breathing. The dream had felt so real, too real. I rubbed my arms absent-mindedly, trying to shake off the lingering cold that seemed to have seeped into my bones. That's when I noticed it. On my wrist, where no mark had been before, was a faint bruise. It was small, just the shape of a handprint, as if someone had gripped me tightly while I slept. My stomach churned. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I must have bumped into something without realizing it. But deep down, I knew better. The boy's voice still lingered in my head, the words repeating like a haunting melody. "Pass it on." The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, a fleeting nightmare brought on by too much late-night internet and not enough sleep. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every little thing felt off, like the world had been tilted ever so slightly. At work, I was a mess. My hands trembled as I typed, and I found myself rereading the same lines over and over without comprehending a word. Voices around me blended into a dull hum, and every creak or sudden movement made me flinch. I retreated to the bathroom for a moment of calm, but when I looked in the mirror, my reflection seemed wrong. At first glance, it was normal. Just me, tired and pale, dark circles under my eyes. But the longer I stared, the more something felt off. My eyes seemed too wide. The corners of my mouth pulled just slightly downward, like I was frowning without realizing it. The lighting in the room seemed harsher, casting shadows across my face that didn't match the angles of the overhead bulbs. I blinked and turned away, trying to brush it off. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't let sleep take me. Whatever this was, dream or otherwise, I wasn't going to let it happen again. I brewed a pot of coffee, each cup bitter and scalding, and opened my laptop. My search history showed the forum thread I'd visited, but when I clicked the link, I was met with an error message. Page not found. I tried refreshing, even digging through cached versions of the site, but it was as though the post had never existed. By the time the clock struck 3 a.m., exhaustion had become a physical weight. My eyes burned, my head throbbed, and my body ached with the effort of staying upright. I must have dozed off without realizing it because suddenly, I was back in the dream. This time the room was smaller, claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to close in around me. The air was thicker, carrying a metallic tang like rust or blood. The brothers were closer now, their details sharper and more vivid. The smiling boy was holding something this time. In his pale hand, he gripped a rusted knife. Its jagged edge was chipped and uneven, glinting faintly in the dim light of the dream. He didn't move at first, just stood there, tilting the blade so it caught the light. His smile stretched wider, revealing sharp, uneven teeth. It was the kind of smile that promised pain, the kind that made your stomach twist with dread. He stepped toward me, slow and deliberate, dragging the blade across the wall as he walked. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, only deeper and more grating. I tried to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed. The fear was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Visceral, all-consuming. My throat burned as I strained against the silence, but no sound escaped. The boy stopped just in front of me. He didn't use the knife. He didn't need to. He just held it up, letting the dim light gleam off its jagged surface, while his smile stretched impossibly wide, his teeth catching the same eerie glow. When I woke, I was gasping for air. My chest heaved, my hands clutching at the couch cushions. The terror stayed with me, as real and sharp as if I'd never left the dream. And then I noticed it. A fresh cut on my arm, thin but deep, just where I'd seen him drag the blade. Blood seeped through the tear in my sleeve, staining the fabric crimson. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they became more vivid, more violent. Each night, the smiling boy brought new horrors. Chains, hammers, a blowtorch. His arsenal grew with each visit. He didn't need to use them right away. Just the sight of them was enough to send my heart racing. But when he did, the pain was excruciating, searing into me as though it were real. And every time I woke, the injuries followed me. Burns that stung in the shower, bruises that ached with the slightest touch, deep gashes that left trails of dried blood on my sheets. They didn't stay confined to my dreams for long. Soon, I began seeing the brothers while I was awake. Their faces would appear in mirrors, just for a split second before vanishing. I'd catch glimpses of them in the corners of my vision, just enough to make me question whether I was losing my mind. One day, as I sat by the window trying to distract myself with the view of the street below, I froze. They were standing there, in plain sight. The blank-faced boy stared up at me, motionless, while the smiling one raised his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he waved. The worst part wasn't the dreams or the visions. It wasn't even the injuries that haunted me into waking life. It was his voice. Always the same, soft and menacing, like a whisper carried on a cold breeze. Pass it on. I was desperate. When a new message popped up in my work inbox with an attachment, the answer became painfully clear. It didn't matter who. I just needed to pass it on. My eyes landed on Lisa, an accountant who worked 2 floors down. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the break room once or twice. She'd mentioned liking creepy stories during one of those awkward small talk moments. I convinced myself it was harmless, just another weird internet joke. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing. Hey Lisa, thought you might find this interesting. Creepy stuff. I attached the photo, hit send, and stared at the screen, waiting for the confirmation that it had gone through. When it did, relief flooded me. The weight I'd been carrying for days seemed to lift, replaced by the fragile hope that this nightmare might finally be over. But the next morning, Lisa didn't come to work. At first, no one seemed to notice. The office buzzed with the usual hum of phones ringing and keyboards clacking. But by lunchtime, whispers started spreading. She hadn't called in. No one had heard from her. By the second day, Lisa's absence was impossible to ignore. Her manager sent an email to the entire department asking if anyone had been in contact with her. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared at the message. I wanted to believe she'd just taken a personal day, that she'd show up soon with an apologetic smile and a story about losing her phone. But deep down, I knew better. That afternoon, when I checked my inbox, the email I'd sent to her had bounced back, undeliverable. The blood drained from my face. My hands trembled as I reread the message. It didn't make sense. I'd seen the email go through. I'd watched the little sent notification pop up. Yet here it was, as though it had never reached her at all. The office felt too small, too bright. I hurried home, my pulse racing the entire way. Now I'm here, sitting in my dimly lit apartment, typing this out as fast as I can. The lights flicker every few minutes, plunging the room into brief, suffocating darkness. I can hear soft creaks behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the old wooden floor. The voice is back. It's no longer distant or faint. "Pass it on," it whispers, low and raspy, so close I can feel the cold breath against my ear. I don't need to turn around. I already know they're standing right behind me. So here I am, sharing my story with you. Maybe it's just another urban legend, another meaningless tale to scroll past before you move on with your day. Or maybe it's more than that. When you close this window, will you feel it too? That cold, creeping prickle at the back of your neck? The sense of eyes watching you from the shadows? The choice is yours now. Will you leave it be? Or will you pass it on?